Hello, I've been asked to make something called a Fairbairn Sykes Agent's Knife or Agent's Dagger. And everybody probably is familiar with Fairbairn Sykes Combat Knife, which is a pretty famous knife that almost every knife company makes a copy of or has a version of. When the guy was asking me about an agent's knife, I really honestly had no idea what he was talking about. So I had to do quite a bit of research and learn a lot about the thing myself. And one of the first things I learned was that there are lots of different versions of an agent's knife. From things that would fit inside the lapel of your suit to bigger daggers that were just meant to be a little bit more concealable. So another thing I learned is that an agent's knife was typically 3/4 the size of a full-sized Fairbairn Sykes Commando knife. So doing a whole bunch of research, I found some original plans that were actually, I think it says, designed or drawn out in a book by Fairbairn. So I've gotten the knife to this point, and I'm going to take it apart and show you everything, and I'm going to show you every step from here on out. But it really made no sense for me to show you up to this point because everybody's going to have a different method of getting here. So this is the original design drawn out. It had, it's got all the dimensions on there. You can find this on the Wikipedia page, but it looks like the handle was about 4.5 inches, and it was a stick tang with a guard and then a brass nut to secure things together. And he specified that the handle should be checked, and he's got kind of an interesting shape, which I'm going to try to eventually get to. I may not. The overall blade was just about 7 inches in length, and it was 1/4 inch steel, and then there was a ricasso area. And he goes to the, shows you at every point on the original drawings how much it's supposed to taper down and everything like that. The other thing to notice is that the blade right at the guard is a little under 1 inch. So what I did was I did a little research and came up with some measurements, and I found a commercially made guard at Jantz Supply, part number CP221, which has a 1 inch by 1/4 inch slot, and it's brass. So my knife is going to be a little bit wider this way than the original, but I really couldn't avoid it because I really don't want to go to the trouble of actually making a guard. I've done that before and it's a pain in the butt, and they never quite seem to fit the way I want them to. So to notice here, I made the blade from the front of the guard on 5 3/4 inches in length, which is about 3/4 the size of a traditional commando dagger. The ricasso area I kept at 9/16 inches, which was typical for the time period and also what was specified on the original drawings. The area where the guard sits is right here, and that has to be 1 inch tall, and then you need a little bit of a lip. It's a 1/16 inch on either side of that, so that the guard has something to rest against on the blade so it doesn't slide down the blade. I made the stick tang a 1/4 inch wide. From where the guard is going to sit to the back of the handle is 4 3/4 inches. Now, with the stick tang being a 1/4 inch wide, what that eventually means is that you're going to round it off, or I did, so that it would fit through a 21/64 inch hole drilled through a piece of wood. So you can see it here. The guard, fits right. I mean, you can pretty much probably just line this up and see what I did there. The guard sits exactly as it should. And then I threaded this with 1/4 inch 20 threads per inch, and I also did the same with the brass nut. So that's how everything is going to come together. This is a piece of lignum vitae that I've started using. This was traditionally used as pins and ships because it's a really oily wood and pretty dense, and it basically takes care of itself. The other thing this was used for was billy clubs back in the day. Now, to get to this point, like I was explaining, there's a lot of ways to do this. You can forge most of the way here and then finish with files. You could do stock removal, but the part where you need to be really precise is right here, right in this area. And the reason you want to be precise there is so that this guard fits nice and tight. Now, when I do a guarded knife, I always like to solder things together, but this particular version is going to have both solder, and then this will be glued in place, and it'll be mechanically secured with a nut. So all this was the easy part. Now we have to do the hard part. Now I actually have to get bevels in here that work, and I'm going to try to get a nice, perfect center line. That's very difficult to do. I've only done that correctly just a couple times. This is only the second dagger of this design or description that I've ever made. So without further ado, let's go to the shop. So now I'm at the point where the hard work starts. What I have to do is I have to grind the bevels in, and there are 4 bevels on a dagger, and they all have to meet, and you want to have them so that the line where they meet comes down the center of the blade and is straight. Now that sounds easy, but it's actually very difficult, and at least for me. So I figured this would be one thing that I could show that maybe you'd get something out of. I'll show you kind of how I approach that. So what this is a bubble jig. I have not, for whatever reason, been able to figure out how to do a grind using this method where you have a platen down here and you rest it on there, and a lot of guys will make like a jig to hold it, and I just haven't been able to make that work. So I do these freehand with a little bubble here, and if you keep that bubble in the middle, you're getting a pretty consistent angle, and then I find it easy to make adjustments to what I'm doing if things get a little bit off. So I'm going to show how to set the bubble jig up and then how to do a little bit of this. So the first thing is you've got this like little holder deal that you clamp your knife in and get it nice and tight so it doesn't move. And what you're going to do is when you're working, you use this to kind of hold the knife and keep it steady. And what you want to do is get this to go and then have a consistent angle, and then flip it over and do the same thing over there. The next thing you do is set your angle. And when I'm starting any kind of a grind, I like to start off fairly steep. So this is a wedge that when I set it on here, figures out basically 12 degrees. Then I put my bubble jig on here, and I have to adjust it so that bubble is in the middle. We can get it started here. And now I know, once I have that set, that if I have that bubble in the middle, I'll be grinding at 12 degrees. So it's basically magnetic, and it clips to there. And what you do is you figure out what your angle is going to be, and then you slide this along like this, obviously with the belt running, and try to keep that bubble in the middle. And usually what I do is I do 3 passes on one side, at least when I'm starting. Then you flip it over, put the bubble on the other side, and do 3 passes the other way, trying to keep that bubble in the middle. So I'll show you at least a little bit of doing this. So I can see from this that I'm doing good on the front part, but I need to do this back part a little bit better to get that nice even line all the way across there. And probably what I'm doing is I'm angling it a little bit too much like this and not this way. So what I'm going to do for a couple passes here is I'm going to start with it right where I want that plunge line to go, and then just bring it this way so that I'm sure I'm flat. See, this is what I meant by adjusting it. You look, you check your work, and then you make little adjustments. Getting better. Probably one more pass will bring that to where I want it to be. There. That's pretty good. Maybe just a little bit more up in this area. Just a little bit more. And it's not so crucial, like right at the beginning here, to get that absolutely perfect. I just wanted to show you the concept of like adjusting and stuff. So now I have to flip it over and do, 3 passes and try to get this amount of steel off on the other side. This side's a lot more even so far. Doing pretty good. Let's see, comparing the two sides, I need to take a little bit more steel off of this side to make it match that. I was probably holding a little more pressure at the start, and that's why there's more off of there. So I'll make another pass here. There. That's about the amount we want off. I'll probably just take a little bit more off of here. And basically what I do is I do this until I get the thickness down to about a dime thickness. And I want that line to line up in the middle. I also want to make sure that right here, these plunge lines meet at about the same spot. And what I want to do is I want to bring this one back just a little bit. Just a little bit. And it's good to get that stuff right at the start, because later, as this line gets deeper, you'll feel a groove. Like you'll know if you're right when you're in there, and also when you bump up against the plunge line, you'll be able to feel it if you're paying attention. So it's real crucial to get those things to match right away, and this one needs to come back like a millimeter. And to do that, probably what I'll do is I'll start here and then drag it out, as opposed to starting at the tip and going that way. Later, as I'm doing this, rather than starting right at the plunge line, I'll start a little bit forward of the plunge line and work back to it, and then bump up against it and then draw out. And that way I don't end up accidentally coming down on top of a nice plunge line and rounding off the edge. Okay, so looks like I've got one set of the bevels done. The plunge lines match up as perfect as I can get them. I've ground it down to about dime thickness all the way through. Looking at it on end, the plunge lines are even all the way through, and they're nice, and you know, there's no jaggedy parts to it. So that side is done. Now I need to do the other side, and this is where it actually gets difficult. It's easy for me to make one edge, but now trying to make another edge and having everything meet. And you can see that since this line, bevel line, passes the midline, it's going to have to blend in, and keeping it blended into the center is the hard part. And sometimes you have to go really slow. You might notice that I have the belt not moving very quickly at all, and so it takes me longer to grind things, but it's if you make a mistake, usually it's a small mistake that you can get out pretty easily. So I have to flip this over in the bubble jig, and we'll start on the other side. So I've got things pretty close. The bevels match up pretty darn good on both sides. The line is mostly centered, and I can get it the rest of the way just by hand, just little teeny tiny little, you know, adjustments here and there. And sometimes I even do that just with hand sanding and sandpaper. And there will be a certain amount of finishing that I'll have to do after I heat treat this. So one thing that did get a little screwy is this bevel back here got rounded off. Remember, earlier I talked about a trick that you can do to avoid that. I don't think that's going to cause a major problem, because a lot of times the ricasso area these edges will get softened when you go to finish this with buffing and things like that. And I can disguise that little problem right there by taking a little off over here with the buffer. These ones are pretty darn close. So now I'm just going to go and just do some really slow sanding to try to get this as close to as possible to perfect. And then we'll have to buff this area and stamp it prior to heat treatment. But I want to get this as close to perfect as I can prior to heat treatment. Interestingly, after heat treatment, I still come back and grind a little bit on here, and sometimes I prefer doing a little bit of post-heat treatment grinding just to get things perfect, because less steel comes off with each pass, and so it's harder to make big mistakes. I leave the edges about dime thickness, and the reason I do that is to when we heat treat, then the edges don't get burnt. Now I've got to buff the ricasso area so that I can stamp it and get it basically to a pretty good finished form before stamping, so that way later on I don't accidentally buff the marker off trying to get these tool marks out. Now I'm all stamped up and about as good as I can get this prior to heat treatment. I will have to do just a little bit more fine tuning after heat treatment, but I think at that point it's less dangerous. The other thing is I have to put an edge on it, and I'll do a convex edge, which is the easiest kind of edge I know how to do. But now it's time to go into the heat treat oven for a little heat treat action. Okay, here goes. Hopefully we didn't get any warping and stuff like that. Looks pretty straight. I don't think we got any warping. Now what I have to do is temper this. It's very fragile at this state. If I were to drop it, there's a chance it could break, so I'm going to be really careful. And once it's all tempered, we'll move on to some more steps. So I've got it mocked up again. I haven't glued anything together, but now what I want to do is I want to get a lot of this handle shaping and some other finishing done before I put glue on there. For instance, on the Fairbairn Sykes knives, they tended to have a little bit more of a, the back of the handle was thinner than the front of the handle, and I want to do that, but the danger is that there is still a tang running through there, and if I get so thin that it exposes the tang, I want that to happen before I've glued this together, because undoing that can be pretty difficult. So I'll get started and do some shaping now. So what I've done there is I've narrowed down the back end, and I've even made just a little bit of a lip to prevent your hand from slipping off the back. Now I want to take the slack belt and kind of work this way a little bit. Keep it thin but not get into the exposing the tang territory. So that's kind of what I was going for, is have this be just a little bit thinner without getting into issues with exposing the tang. Now I need to work on the front here a bit, get that a little bit cleaner and a little bit more even. So now I've got that looking about like I want it. There'll be some fine finishing work to do later. But if you look here, there's some metal from the actual blade showing, and what I'll want to do is get that polished up as much as possible before attaching the handle, because it can be difficult to get into tight spots like that later on. The next step is going to be to solder this guard in place, and in order to protect the hardness of the blade, what I do is I wrap the blade in a wet cloth, and I just make sure that I don't heat up in this area, that I concentrate the heat down here at the back part of the ricasso and then also on the tang and the guard. I use a low temperature solder so that it won't get hot enough theoretically to wreck any temper, especially if I've got this blade protected from a lot of heat. And obviously go slowly and don't screw up. So there, it's done. Before I do a whole lot, I want to clean up that solder. It went through nicely, and we'll clean that up, and maybe even, I think I'll shape the guard after this. If you remember on the original model, the entire width of the guard should be 2 inches, and so I've got a fair amount of brass to shave off to make that happen. So here's where we're at now. I have just a little bit more shaping I want to do on the handle before I commit and glue this up, but so far it's looking to be a pretty nice little dagger. I think it's going to come out nice. The last thing I do before gluing up the handle here is to get this scale off of the blade and just double check that the bevels are exactly where I want them. That's usually a pretty slow process with a 120 grit belt, with the thing going nice and slow so that I don't screw this up. We've come pretty far. That's about as good as I can make it. So What I'm going to do now is glue it up, and I'll be right back. Now we got a little shaping to do on the handle. It's all glued up. I need to take this threaded end back even, and then I want to round out the back of this nut a little bit. And then there's just some general things. It's a little bit proud over here. I need to bring that back, and then we'll finish sanding it up and stuff. It's nice and flush. Now to get some of the facets out there and to kind of smooth that up a little bit, I'm going to use a Scotch-Brite belt. It's a little bit less aggressive and it polishes at the same time. It's a lot better, and then the buffing will smooth it out even a little bit more, but I like the look of that butt cap with the little deal on there. Now I'll work a little bit on the handle. Again, I think it's a little bit proud in this area, and I need to get it sanded up right. Getting the handle right would be a lot easier with a lathe. I just don't own one. Alright, got the handle basically done. Not much else I can do to this to make it better, so it's time to take this dime thickness down and put a convex edge on. Now we'll buff things up to get it nice and shiny. Well, that's about as perfect of a job as I can do. I still have to clean it up a little bit. The bevels are as even as I can make them, certainly by hand. And I think it's pretty sharp. Let's test it. Oh yeah, it's shaving sharp. Nice little Fairbairn Sykes Agent's Dagger. Hopefully the guy that gets it is happy with it. And I didn't show, you know, every single step and every single technique, but if there's something you have a question about, I can always make another video for you if you want. Thanks for watching.